This week on Thinking Deeply About Primary Education.
I think the kind of key thing to kind of make sure that's really kind of embedded is staff's understanding of disciplinary knowledge.
How does that fit when we think about novice versus expert?
Each discipline, so I'm thinking about science, geography, history here, has its own kind of unique like language and practices and ways of constructing knowledge.
What does disciplinary literacy look like in primary subjects?
Super excited about it. I was really proud of what I'd written, and I'd sent the model essay that I'd written to our curriculum director, who completely tore it apart. So she was like, right, you've nailed the substantive knowledge, you've absolutely missed completely what we mean by disciplinary knowledge and how to actually write within that discipline.
Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Juli Ryzop.
Hello, everybody. Lovely to be here.
And Elliot Morgan.
Hello.
Well, welcome back, Elliot, for another appearance. Julie, this is your first time, so I thought we'd maybe start with a bit about who you are and how you got here today.
Lovely. Thank you, Kieran. Really excited to be here today. So a little bit about me. I currently work for Knowledge Schools Trust. I've got an amazing role. I feel very lucky, very privileged. So for 3 days a week, I'm deputy head teacher across West London Free School Primary and Earls Court Free School Primary. And then for 2 days a week, I work within our central school support team, where I work across the 7 primaries that we have in our trust, predominantly looking at implementing PKC, which is the primary knowledge curriculum, really effectively, but also making sure that our subject leaders and middle leaders are really strong. And then other aspects that kind of build upon that. So I develop phase leaders. I look at developing our teaching assistants across the trust as well, making sure that that kind of collaborative working policy that we have is really well implemented. So yeah, really varied role. And then prior to that, I was within our central primary knowledge curriculum team for the last 3 to 4 years, where I worked with Elliot, Alex Pethick, Emma Leonard, Naomi Pilling, some of whom you've had on your podcast before. And that was honestly such an incredible, fun role to be in, because all we did was talk and think and write about all things curriculum. And it was just like a privilege to be in that role, and working alongside such clever, interesting, fun people. So that's a little bit about me.
I mean, what a group of people to be spending your days with. I mean, that sounds fantastic. The kind of thinking that must have gone on is, well, obviously we're seeing the fruits of that now, aren't we, with the primary knowledge curriculum and stuff. Your current job sounds really interesting too. You know, if you're thinking about dream jobs, deputy head wise, are you operational at all, or are you thinking about pedagogy and teaching and learning, that kind of thing?
Both. So operational focused and thinking about kind of staff development. Attendance is on my remit this year. I've never had to do anything like that. So it's been interesting stepping outside of just thinking about curriculum, but also thinking about how to run a school really effectively. But yeah, it's been a big learning curve, but I've loved it.
That's fantastic. And thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us in this episode. We're going to focus our attention on disciplinary literacy, and it can quite often be misunderstood. How would you define it in a workable definition for schools?
Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting question. So when I was kind of initially thinking about disciplinary literacy more kind of broadly and holistically, I was thinking about where does it begin? And I think the kind of key thing to kind of make sure that's really kind of embedded is staff's understanding of disciplinary knowledge. And I kind of start with that kind of premise, because for me, disciplinary literacy refers to the specific ways of thinking, speaking, reading, and writing that are characteristic of different academic disciplines. So having to delve into like the thinking aspect first, I think that schools need to really understand what we mean by disciplinary knowledge. And therefore really thinking about, okay, how is that interwoven into your kind of curriculum that you have, so that before you even get onto the disciplinary literacy aspect, which I'm thinking here now about like the speaking, the reading, the writing, what does the actual, how do professionals within a specific field of study actually cultivate and create this new knowledge to be, thinking, speaking, reading, and writing about. So as a kind of a long way of kind of going around your kind of question, I think it refers to, like I said, the specific ways of thinking, speaking, reading, and writing that are unique to each of the academic disciplines. And that's because I think each discipline, so I'm thinking about science, geography, history here, has its own kind of unique like language and practices and ways of constructing knowledge. So disciplinary literacy, I think, focuses on developing our pupils' abilities to really understand and effectively use disciplinary specific language and grammar skills. And I think the language and the grammar skills is really important. So having an understanding of what we mean by disciplinary grammar, so the kind of specific grammatical kind of structures and conventions that are used within a particular discipline. So not just the kind of language and the vocabulary, but also the like sentence structures and the stylistic kind of choices that you kind of make as a writer, as an author, that are really unique to that kind of particular field of study.
So as you went through that definition, you were talking about disciplinary literacy being about teaching children that within each discipline, there is a way of thinking and communicating, writing, and so on. How does that fit when we think about novice versus expert? So is it that we're trying to get 8-year-olds to be mini scientists and we're getting 8-year-olds to be mini geographers? Where does disciplinary literacy fall in that sort of continuum of novice versus expert? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it can start really softly from the get-go. So all the way from EYFS, when we're first just really softly inducting our real youngest pupils into what it means to be a scientist, to be a geographer, to be a historian. So, I'm thinking about the EYFS classroom and thinking about the provision that might link to the unit or the subject that's being taught, and thinking about those real kind of age appropriate activities that you're putting together for your pupils that just softly induct them into that kind of way of thinking and speaking like a historian, a scientist, or a geographer. So I'm just kind of thinking of examples that our EYFS teams have done recently. So, having a magnifying glass out and asking them to go on like a spring watch when they're studying the growing and changing unit. If it's something to do with history, maybe if they're looking at past and present, getting, artifacts up of, I'm thinking on the spot here, but, coins, Roman coins, for example, in comparison to like modern currency. If it's geography, it's having a map of the classroom out and getting the children to find the treasure. So just really softly inducting our youngest pupils into just spotting these kind of soft ideals around, what is science, what is history, what is geography. And it's not to say that by the end of EYFS they need to absolutely know the difference. They don't, but it's just this kind of soft introduction into it.
The reason I ask it is because I think there's sometimes perhaps a misconception around the utility of disciplinary literacy, and that people may argue like the distinction between a novice and expert is that novices don't learn in the same way that experts do. So are we just trying to make them become expert by doing what experts do? And it's, as what you said there, is that it's about it being age appropriate. And that's why it being like carefully sequenced, and it starts in early years. It's very basic, like you said, introductory, foundational knowledge, like here's a magnifying glass, then you're building it up over time.
I mean, I'm sure we can all imagine those situations where it's not age appropriate, but the kids are quote unquote mathematicians, or they are quote unquote geographers, and really, those are the situations where not a lot of learning happens in classrooms. What does disciplinary literacy look like in primary subjects?
Yeah, so I think this is a great question. When I was kind of putting together some notes for this part of the podcast, this was like the bulkiest bit for me, and the bit that I really like to sink my teeth into. So, like I've said previously, I think getting staff and pupils really understanding what we mean by disciplinary knowledge. And for our teaching staff and our support staff, we kind of hammer home Christine's Council's definition of disciplinary knowledge, which I think, like, to this day is probably the kind of most interesting and best articulated. So she talks about disciplinary knowledge being this kind of curriculum term for what students learn about how that knowledge was established, its degree of certainty, and how it continues to be revised by scholars, artists, or professional practice. It's the part of the subject where pupils understand each discipline as a tradition of inquiry with its own distinct pursuit of truth. And I love that kind of distinct pursuit of truth aspect to how she's kind of coined and defined disciplinary knowledge. So for us, it's getting our staff really understanding, okay, well, what does this look like in science? How does this compare to geography? What does this look like in history? So really getting kind of their own subject knowledge really secure by what we mean across these, in this context, these three foundation subjects. And then I think once our staff's own subject knowledge of not just the substantive knowledge that they teach, but the disciplinary knowledge is secure, we can then get them thinking about disciplinary literacy. So we get them thinking about, okay, well, how do professionals in that academic field speak, read, and write? So we think really carefully in primary about the kind of resources that we're using with our pupils, from perhaps texts or extracts that we're kind of selecting as curriculum designers, to also how our pupils write any of their own resources, or how they prepare their own PowerPoints or use Active Inspire, and we call it flip charts. And then also delving into the way, well, how are they modeling the correct speech and the correct language? So I know that our subject lead, Nadia Khan, she did this big piece of work on upskilling our teachers within the context of RE, in making sure that they're using the most appropriate modal verbs when articulating a point of view from a particular subsection of religion. So this idea that you're using the phrase, some Christians believe that, whereas others might argue that. So that if you are someone that's a practicing Christian, but it's a slightly different branch or denomination of Christianity that's being taught within the lessons, you're not suddenly then feeling, a bit on edge or a bit excluded, because actually, do you know what, I don't do that as a Christian. So just by tweaking that kind of language at the beginning means that you're thinking really carefully about the fact that it's not just this kind of blanket statement for all. There are nuances to it. So when I kind of started this kind of deep dive into disciplinary literacy, it actually started all the way back in 2018, where for the 6th lesson in each of our units, it's an assessment lesson. And in that assessment lesson, I was in year 6 at the time, we write essays. So for science, for geography, for history. And the essay that we were writing, I was thinking, right, I really want to write a real good model right for this, so that I can show this to the children, I can show it to the other year 6 team, and we've got like a base to go off. So the unit at the time that we were teaching and, preparing the flips for was the suffragette unit. And I started writing this like model essay, and I was super excited about it. I was really proud of what I'd written. And I'd sent the model essay that I'd written to our curriculum director, Alex Pethick, who like completely tore it apart. So she was like, right, you've nailed the substantive knowledge, but you've absolutely missed completely what we mean by disciplinary knowledge and how to actually write within that discipline. Now, for context, I don't even have a history GCSE. So my only like history schooling was between the ages of year 7 and year 9, with very minimal history teaching at primary. So for someone who's not inducted into the discipline of history, I wrote my history essay for that suffragette unit in the same kind of tone and style that I would have written my psychology essays at uni. So the kind of final paragraph was very kind of like opinion heavy. And Alex, who is a historian and who has a degree specializing in history, kind of unpicked it and explained to me why that isn't appropriate for when historians write essays, because you don't lead with personal bias. It's really important as a historian that you remove personal bias, as much as you can, and actually just present the facts or the argument in kind of a logical kind of way. So that kind of got me interested into what do we mean by all of this, and what are those kind of soft nuances that experts realize are happening in this, or maybe, implicitly don't realize are happening within their fields, and how can we make that kind of implicit really explicit. So I just went on this kind of journey of starting with year 6, but then also year 5, because I was the phase leader at the time, of writing all of the model essays for history, geography and science, getting really good feedback from subject experts in that field on how I'd written them. And then I did lots of research into, well, what are all of these language nuances? What are all of these grammar nuances? And basically tried to codify it. So, for example, in history, you're much more likely to use the active voice in comparison to science, where you're much more likely to use the passive voice. And the reason for that is because in history, the active voice gives ownership to the agent of the change. So, for example, if I was writing in the active voice, I would say, by 1750, Britain established colonies in West Africa. So the agent of the change, Britain, is given the ownership to that action performed. Whereas if it was written in the passive voice, it would be written such as, by 1750, colonies in Western Africa were established by the British. And in that context, the kind of ownership of the agent of the change is kind of left too far to one side, whereas it needs to be kind of front and center. And in contrast with science, where you're more likely to use the passive voice, and that's because science is the story of the materials. And in scientific writing, in academic scientific writing, the researcher is kind of omitted from the write-up. Because, like I said, science is the story of the materials, and you're telling the materials story. So you could say something in the passive voice, such as the DNA samples were analyzed by advanced sequencing techniques. So that would be it written in the passive, as opposed to the active, which could be, scientists used advanced sequencing techniques to analyze DNA samples. So with the passive, it's just focusing on the materials and not the researcher. But, all of this has got slight nuances and caveats to it as well. And geography, for example, which geography in itself is a real interdisciplinary subject. Sometimes when you're a geographer, you're thinking a little bit like a historian, especially if you're thinking about continuity and change over time. But then at times you're also thinking like a scientist. So for geographers, when a geographer writes, they might use both the passive and the active voice in their writing, depending on, I don't know, the context or their kind of communication goals. And ultimately, the choice between active and passive really depends on the writer's intention, and I suppose the emphasis that they want to convey or the level of agency they wish to highlight. And I think both have their place in geographical writing, and you kind of make those kind of strategic decisions in order to kind of communicate the point that you're trying to make effectively. So yeah, I just got really interested in the kind of language and the grammar. So some other examples would be, in history, you're more likely to use the past perfect tense. So using that kind of auxiliary verb had followed by the past participle of the main verb. So you might say, by the time Berlin Wall fell in 1989, the Cold War had been marked by decades of ideological confrontation and geopolitical maneuvering. You might also use more subordinate clauses, for example, in history writing, because a subordinate clause, especially if you've got the commas around it for parenthesis, adds that kind of additional information or that context or those details that's really important in historical writing. Whereas in science, things such as modal verbs are really important to get right, because a modal verb can indicate either certainty or possibility. And I think they can make writing way more trustworthy. So you could say, based on the data, it appears that species might be more resilient to environmental changes. In science, you're much more likely to use the future tense, especially towards your kind of discussion and conclusions. So you might talk about, what kind of future research objectives there might be, what kind of future outcomes there might be. In science as well, in the methodology section, you might be more likely to use those kind of command words, which are kind of specific verbs ultimately that convey certain actions. So, calculate the velocity, determine the pH, measure the length, test the hypothesis. Whereas in geography, really nailing prepositions is really important. So, really accurately describing the location of something. So the Great Wall of China stretches across northern China. The summit of Mount Everest is above the clouds, whatever it might be. But in each discipline, in your geography, in your history, in your science, there are these real subtle, small grammatical and language nuances that experts, I think, take for granted, that our kind of real novice learners, our pupils, need to be kind of explicitly taught. So the way we kind of do that within our trust is all of the resources that are presented to the children reflect the academic discipline that's being studied. But then we also, when we're actually teaching children the skill of writing, we dedicate English curriculum time in order to do that really successfully. So our English curriculum at the end of each half term, the final week, so all 5 English lessons are dedicated to disciplinary literacy. So by the end of each half term from year 2 up to year 6, our children would have written an extended write or an essay in history, geography and science twice. So 2 history essays, 2 geography essays, 2 science essays or extended writes by the end of each academic year. So by the time they get to year 6, they feel really confident and really fluent in being able to kind of independently code switch from one subject discipline to another.
Do you have peers who you have the conversations with about this, or is it just this is the depths to which you've decided to go one day?
Well, I suppose the PKC team. So I pick their brains. I've only really gone into depth with the science, the geography, then the history, but I really want to pick Naomi's brain and delve into the disciplinary literacy associated with art, and then also Nadia Khan's brain on the disciplinary literacy associated with RE, because I think there's so much more to learn. And in terms of books that I've read or kind of people that I've kind of gone to, so Tim Shanahan is a big thinker, big writer about all things disciplinary literacy. Alex Quigley has written about disciplinary literacy in his books as well, and on some of his blogs. Catherine Mortimer, again, has written a brilliant book, slightly more secondary focused, but there's lots of elements that are applicable to primary. And then Shireen Wilkinson's in the process of writing a book on disciplinary literacy and how it's more applicable to primary. So I've had some really, great people to be able to kind of chat to and bounce ideas with. But I think the key is just like reading around the subject and actually like engaging with like scientific academic articles, like history books, geographical articles. I literally sat there, printed things out and just highlighted and kind of like pattern spotted across and then tried to codify it. And then what I realized is that our grammar curriculum at Key Stage 2 actually really lends itself to being able to map together which kind of grammar strands link to which kind of academic disciplinary field. And then we've interwoven that as well into our grammar curriculum. So the examples that we're sharing with our children as part of our SPAG kind of 2-hour session that they have, 2 half-an-hour sessions in Key Stage 2. The examples that we're showing are some fiction-based examples, but then the non-fiction examples link directly to the history, the geography and the science, so that the children are kind of implicitly learning the history, geography, science, but then explicitly learning the grammar that's associated with it.
I mean, as you were speaking, I was thinking, well, this is a really clear reason why we have the expectations on pupil grammar that we do. And I imagine that more often than not, possibly being taught in isolation as standalone rules, but with that sort of, with those connections, with tying everything together, it just makes so much more sense. Then it becomes a natural part of how children write, which is, I think, in my opinion, much better for them in the long run, rather than the sort of typical way I would have taught pupils to write with them, like a big hot piece at the end of the term with as much onomatopoeia as possible, So I mean, you can tell you understand the grammar and because you were giving me active and passive examples off the top of your head. No one does that. People had to think about this stuff all the time. So I mean, I think it's amazing.
I may be wrong. I may be misquoting the report here, but I believe in the EEF disciplinary literacy report, it talks about grammar, the evidence behind it, that suggesting that it's best taught in context. So as all those great examples that Julie's gave us, when you're teaching children about passive, like you're doing it in the context of that scientific writing rather than being taught in isolation. And I believe the report says that it's more effective when it is taught in context.
Oh, that makes tons of sense. And certainly in terms of what it looks like, I think you've done a fantastic job of explaining, probably just a fraction of what it might look like in primary, but definitely really helpful for teachers. What are the biggest challenges schools face in trying to develop disciplinary literacy?
I think the kind of key thing that jumps to mind is making sure that, first of all, your curriculum in science, history, geography has the disciplinary knowledge interwoven. So for me, that's the thing to kind of nail first. And then it's about developing staff's subject knowledge of the disciplinary knowledge that's specific to each field, before then delving into the subject knowledge that staff need when understanding the disciplinary literacy nuances that are associated with history, geography, and science in this context. So I think time and CPD time is needed to really develop expert teachers that understand these nuances, because then they'll in their own teaching will be able to give really pertinent feedback that moves the children's learning on. So, for example, some of our kind of novice teachers, our ECTs, when I've kind of done learning walks and I've popped into their class, a child might have written in their book, I don't know, like these awesomely amazing ancient Egyptians, because, they're trying to, wow us with the alliteration. And a novice teacher might not understand that actually that isn't appropriate for the kind of academic style that we're trying to teach the children. Whereas a more expert teacher who, really understands the disciplinary knowledge, really understands disciplinary literacy, will be able to unpick why actually that isn't appropriate in that specific context. Because in the context of the kind of writing that we want to see in our history books, in our science books, and in our geography books, is that we want it to be academic, we want it to be formal, we want our children to understand that purpose. But that's not to say that as part of our English curriculum, if the purpose is to entertain, but something you're writing about a non-fiction phenomenon, but the purpose is to entertain, then actually that might be appropriate to describe, in that context, the ancient Egyptians as, awesomely amazing, whatever it might be. But in the context of our history lessons, our science lessons, and our geography lessons, that isn't the kind of tone that we're trying to convey. So I think the biggest challenge is teacher subject knowledge, and then dedicating adequate and enough CPD time to up-leveling that subject knowledge, so that then the models that are being shared with the children are as close to that kind of academic pursuit of truth that's age appropriate for our primary pupils.
That would definitely be the first one that comes to mind. I think it's positive that it seems like sort of knowledge-rich curricula are going to be the fore of any revisions made over the next couple of years. So something for schools definitely to invest in. I mean, what sort of time would you think would be necessary? Are we looking at like termly sort of input or more frequent? I mean, obviously, teacher development is much more complex than I'm sort of portraying here, but what do you envisage almost like the model being? If say I imagine many schools will be starting from scratch. What would you recommend they sort of focus their attention on, and does the frequency change because of that starting point?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the way that we started it in our trust was we always think of CPD as like a program of study and the kind of journey that our staff are going to go on. So the first thing we did is for the first year, really pushed on the disciplinary knowledge. So across science, across history, across geography, we had a series of CPD sessions throughout the year that focused on developing our staff's understanding of disciplinary knowledge in the first instance. Once we felt that was secure with our staff, and we could see then through our monitoring and our kind of evidence gathering that it was starting to filter through and really be understood by our pupils, we then kind of shifted into like focusing in on, well, this is what we mean by disciplinary literacy. And we started kind of big picture, this is what we think disciplinary literacy is. It's, thinking about how professionals within that field think, how they speak, how they read, and how they write. And then we kind of unpicked those 4 things, explaining that, the thinking is the disciplinary knowledge. So we've done that bit. Let's now think about how do professionals in that field speak. So we gave our staff a series of sentence stems that they could be kind of softly introducing within their own kind of day-to-day teaching. So a little bit like that RE example I gave of, like some religions believe that, or some Christians believe that. And we use similar phraseology in history. Some historians have argued that, however, others believe that. So just, this real soft sentence stems that we would then kind of set up for our pupils as well. So, one of the EEF studies talks about, I think it's Lauren Resnick, who talks about accountable talk. So we then kind of, in our curriculum, because every lesson has a talk task that precedes the independent task, we then would add the sentence stems onto there that we'd want our pupils to be using. So those sentence stems would be subject specific to, again, just softly introduce the idea of communicating through talk accurately within that discipline, which would then feed through into their writing. We would then look at, the content that our children are reading within those foundation subjects. Again, does it match that kind of academic tone that we're hoping it matches? And if it doesn't, which, loads of children non-fiction books don't, we explain to the children that these texts were written with a slightly different purpose. Yes, they're non-fiction, but they're written to entertain. And we'd like draw out the examples, especially to our Key Stage 2 children, where perhaps authors have used alliteration or, lots of really fancy adjectives in a text. And we'd explain, okay, well, here this text is entertaining pupils whilst also informing them. But the way that we want to be writing in our history and our geography and our science books is to inform, or it is to explain, or it is to argue, which has a slightly different purpose. I think I've gone off piece there a little bit.
I was definitely thinking of a popular historical alliterative title series that is juxtaposed with the approach that because I know my boys both love them and they've learned a lot, but they haven't necessarily learned much about how how the academics would behave in those fields. And I think they may even have branched out into geography recently. I don't know. I mean, so you can see there, so you almost get your scaffolding, there's the essential knowledge, you've got the scaffold, and then it's piece by piece building up this expertise. Because, something like history, you're not going to be an expert in all areas of the primary curriculum. You can have certainly more expertise in certain areas, but understanding that behavior, I think it makes you more expert than most. And then it's almost like a confidence, because I'm always thinking about the sort of virtuous cycle, that self-propelling motor that, once you feel like, oh, this is my subject, this is my domain, you're more likely to engage in it. And then it's like self-fulfilling prophecy. So what you guys have done there sounds fantastic. And, you can see those features of what makes effective PD, but also I think you've been really realistic in terms of expectations and things. I mean, was Elliot part of it? Was he trained in this way? Because I've always been impressed by his knowledge of substantive knowledge.
Absolutely. We're going to take all credit for Elliot's training.
I've got a question, Julie, because I'm sure there'll be many listeners who are listening to this thinking, this sounds incredible. It's very agreeable. Of course, I want the pupils in my class to think, to write, to speak like the discipline I'm teaching them. But I'm just short on time. And I don't have enough time. And so, because you touched on there being 6 essays across a year, would you encourage teachers to try and do an essay in a single history lesson across different history lessons? What would be the approach that you think disciplinary literacy deserves to ensure that children are actually thinking, communicating in that manner?
I think if you want to do it properly, it can't just happen in a single lesson. I know in our trust initially we tried to do that, and the outcomes that we got from the children, they were good, but they weren't anywhere near as kind of accurate and excellent as they are now. So I would start by breaking it down into your kind of introduction paragraph, your kind of main body 1 and 2 paragraphs, and then your conclusion. And it might be that for our year 2s, we actually write the introduction together. And then for the main body, we give them the first topic sentence and we explain to them what we mean by a topic sentence. And then we get them to think of like 3 points that they might want to add into their paragraph based on whatever the content was that they were learning. And then we might give them the concluding sentence. So we're kind of modeling to them what like a paragraph is. And we might do that in year 2 and year 3 and year 4. And then eventually you're kind of removing those scaffolds. So it might be that over time, the children make their own topic sentences up. They make their own concluding sentences up. I know for us as well, and I'm going off piece here a little bit, but we've differentiated the nuance between what we mean by an essay versus what we mean by an extended write. And this might not be, accurate outside of our trust, but this is the kind of approach we've gone internally at Knowledge Schools Trust. Is for our primaries, we say that an essay has a question that's answered, whereas an extended write is just a longer piece of writing about that subject. So the way that we teach essay writing to our pupils is that if it's an essay question, the first sentence of your main body paragraphs 1, 2, and 3 will directly answer the essay question. So we teach them that topic sentence is directly answering that essay question. Whereas an extended write might just be a longer piece of writing about, a historical recount of events.
If a school is just starting their disciplinary literacy journey, where should they look and what should they do?
So I would say completely shameless plug here. We've got amazing training at Primary Knowledge Curriculum on writing within those three disciplines. So we've got like writing like a historian, writing like a geographer, writing like a scientist training, which initially when I wrote it was 3.5 hours long. So for each subject. Which at Research Ed, I try to condense, 9 hours plus worth of content into a 40-minute session. And your Thinking Deeply About Primary Education conference, which was amazing, by the way. I tried to, reduce 9 hours content into 40 which was great. So yeah, shameless plug, PKC offer amazing training around this. Catherine Mortimer's book is really good on disciplinary literacy, Alex Quigley's books, the EEF study. But like I keep going back to, like the key thing is make sure your curriculum in the first place has the right balance of substantive knowledge and disciplinary knowledge. Like that is the priority of having that well-sequenced, ambitious, really specified curriculum in the first instance, before you then delve into the disciplinary literacy aspect. And making sure that you're bringing the staff on the journey with you, so teachers and support staff, so that they feel really confident and competent at being able to, create their own resources, create their own modelled rights, so that they are accurately, as best as possible, reflecting each academic discipline.
Plugs are absolutely allowed. We don't take sponsorship on the podcast so that we can recommend what we think of the best things for teachers to be spending their attention on and to giving their attention to. And so, 100% check out PKC because, like I say, that group of thinkers, you'd be hard pressed to find a group who are thinking more deeply about the certainly the foundation curriculum. And you've even got people like Elliot who are thinking about modern foreign languages. So it'll be interesting to see what he comes up with when when that project's finished.
It's going to be amazing. I can't wait for it to be released. So that, and music recently has been released as well, which is amazing. Obviously, I'm so biased, but it's really carefully written, really carefully sequenced, and the outcomes of our own pupils within our 7 primaries, I think, really do speak for themselves.
Obviously, we have a lot of like classroom teachers will be listening, and they may not necessarily have responsibility over the entire curriculum or indeed even a subject. What would you say are the only phrase that keeps coming to mind is quick wins, and that's not what I want from an answer from you. I mean, like, what actionable practice can they do in their daily lessons in establishing disciplinary knowledge and disciplinary literacy? What things can they do quite simply? So you talked about sentence stems. What else can they do in their lessons that bring that to life?
Yeah, great question. So I think step 1 is any resource that you're writing, that you're presenting to your children, start really basic. Is it formally written? Written without contractions, for example. So have you got that formal tone? Is it written, if it's history, in the past tense, for example? Is that academic voice coming through? Science, for example, we try not to use first person because, again, when you're thinking about the discipline of science, it's about the story of the materials, not about the scientist. So little small tweaks, such as instead of getting the children to write, I predict that, shift it to the prediction is. And it just forces you to have to then focus on writing in the third person rather than the first person. So yeah, I would say that kind of quick win, for want of a better term, are the resources that you're presenting to your children, are they formal? Are they academic? Are they written in the kind of correct tone to begin with? So if you're giving them a piece of extract to read and you've copied it from I think I know the book series that you're referring to, Kieran, which is amazing and really fun, and the kids utterly love it. But if you're presenting that as part of your history lesson, do your children know that the purpose of that text is written to really entertain children, and it's written in a different style than you would see kind of formal academic history writing? And it could be interesting to compare, to bring it up and actually show, what are the similarities? We can see that the substantive knowledge across the two is correct, but what about that disciplinary knowledge? What about that disciplinary literacy that's feeding through? Can we spot the nuances? How is this one written to entertain, and how is this one written to inform?
I think that'll be really helpful for teachers. This has been a fascinating chat, and hopefully hopefully you've enjoyed it sufficiently that you'll come back and talk about more curricular ideas in the future. All the stuff to do is say thank you very much for joining me. Thank you very much, Julie.
Thank you both so much. It's been fab, and I'd love to come back. And if this is okay, I can share some slides with you, Kieran. That I don't know if you link them into the bottom, or I can share some essays that our children have written as well. I've got some like before and after essays, so like essays that they've written back in 2018 where like the purpose of them wasn't really well understood versus the essays that they're writing now, and the kind of progress that as a trust we've made over the last however many years.
Yeah, I mean, if you're sure that'd be fantastic. I mean, I think the best way probably is to put them in a folder that can be shared, and then I can put it in the description.
Great.
So if anyone's interested in Julie's folder with lots of interesting things to read, check out the description for this podcast wherever you get it. Thanks very much, Elliot.
Thank you. Thanks, Kieran. Thanks, Julie. I mean, I've heard Julie speak about this for years, and I'm still learning more and more for all the time. So thanks, Julie. It was great.
And everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.